Every time you open your eyes, a whole world appears before you, one full of life and technology side by side. Everything that you can see is not everything that can be seen. From the first rules of mathematics to the success of nuclear fusion, this is a history of science, part 1. To understand the history of science, we need to understand how the principles of science first began. Science is simply the observation and understanding of how the universe works, through experiments and results. It's hard to say exactly when humanity started implementing it, as our very first ancestors made stone tools and weapons by experimenting with different things and then applying the results of what they learned. The ones generating these ideas could be considered knowledgeable for their time, and by today's definition could also be called scientists. These primitive societies then went on to form groups and learn to trade, establishing agriculture and learning about arable land and how to domesticate animals. This newfound way of life, to trade and to exchange knowledge, allowed us to move forward into the Bronze Age and all the way to the modern era. It's these primitive societies that paved the way for the future of discovery today. Where we're going to begin our journey, however, is known as the Classical Antiquity, or the Classical Era. This period in time, which lasted from roughly 800 BC to 500 AD, is an era in which a scientific method was born. A scientific method is a process of making an observation, creating a hypothesis, and then creating a conclusion based on the results. While many sources claim the creators of the scientific method to be names like Sir Isaac Newton, Sir Francis Bacon, Galileo, or Ibn al-Haytham, I believe that there can be no doubt the first use and understanding of a scientific method recorded in history came from Aristotle, a Greek philosopher and polymath. Whilst Aristotle is famous for never having tested any of his theories, he still paved the way for logic and reasoning within the scientific field, both of which are essential to scientific theory. Today, we're going to be looking at the history of Aristotle and how he revolutionized the way we perceive the world. Aristotle was born in 384 BC in the ancient Greek city of Stagira. When he was a child, he learned some rudimentary medicine from his father, who was a personal physician to the king of Macedonia. At this time, he had developed a keen interest in learning other fields. When he was around the age of 13, both of his parents died and he was taken under the guardianship of a man named Proxenus of Atanius. Aristotle was cared for and educated by Proxenus until the age of 17, when he decided to move to Athens in order to study at Plato's Academy. He continued his education under Plato for nearly 20 years until Plato's death, sometime between 347 and 348 BC. Records indicate that whilst studying under Plato, Aristotle met a man named Theophrastus, who would become his pupil and travel with Aristotle to the island of Lesbos, where he would meet his first wife, Pythias. Pythias would go on to bear his daughter, who was also named Pythias. Now, I couldn't find any information as to when specific achievements were made by Aristotle in his lifetime, and I couldn't narrow down what year exactly these achievements were made. However, it is believed that the majority of his research was done after this point. Although he was highly gifted and knowledgeable, Aristotle had some wild beliefs that were less founded in science, but rather philosophy. Instead of a table of elements that we know today, Aristotle believed that the earth was made up of 4 elements: earth, water, fire, and air, along with a 5th element called ether, which he claimed as an unchangeable, weightless environment that makes up the heavens. After all, this was well over 2,000 years ago. Even though science was at play, superstition and religious beliefs were still highly regarded. In fact, Aristotle himself believed that God is not a physical entity, but a mental one. God to him was an entity of pure knowledge that can manifest itself and is thought to be the highest level of knowledge one can achieve. In simple terms, this means that to Aristotle there was no traditional God, but rather the act of thinking and moving forward was in itself a deity, which he called the unmoved mover, or as we call today, entropy. The unmoved mover is what set everything in motion, the force that started existence. His reasoning for believing this was that for object A to move, it must be pushed by object B. But then, what pushed object B? This line of thinking is what led him to believe that there must be an underlying cause of motion. Something had to push object B to begin with in order for the movement to be possible. That something is the unmoved mover. Let me know in the comments if you want a more in-depth explanation of all of that. Moving on. At the age of 41, Aristotle was invited by King Philip II of Macedon to tutor his son Alexander III of Macedon, or you may know him as Alexander the Great, who would go on to be one of the greatest military leaders in history after reigning for 13 years undefeated. Aristotle would tutor Alexander until he was 16, and then returned to Athens in order to create his own school, known as Lyceum. He continued his research there and taught lectures until his death in 322 BC, at the age of 62 by natural causes. Aristotle contributed his intellect to a wide range of subjects, many of which he became proficient at, making groundbreaking strides in metaphysics, physics, and politics, to name a few. Within his lifetime, he had written around 200 treatises, which are written documents pertaining to a specific subject. Out of roughly 200, only 31 survived, most of which are drafts or incomplete theorems, specifically pertaining to course studies, but many of which give us a rare and valuable glimpse into this fascinating time period. That's it for today. In part 2, we'll be covering Pythagoras, and how his understanding of mathematics set the stage for people like Aristotle. If you enjoyed this video and you're not yet subscribed, what's wrong with you? The content will only get better from here on out, so smash that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video.